Because I want to is a complete sentence. If you want to do something, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you don't have to justify why. But it comes from this assumption that your wants need to be validated before they're acceptable. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say, I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share in this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations, so please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. So, if you listened to the last episode, you'll know that one was all about the moment I realised that no one is coming to do the internal work for you. And everything that comes with that. The responsibility of it, the weight of it, the way it changes how you move through the world. So this episode is, I feel, the natural next step. Because once you accept the responsibility, the next question is permission. Specifically, who are you waiting for to give it to you? And this podcast, for example, is very much a passion project for me. I'm doing it because I want to, which is exactly the theme of today's episode. So as you've seen, the title, it's Free Will is Reason Enough. And this is something I only really registered relatively recently. I came across the phrase pretty much last year in 2025. Videos of people acting on their impulses, their intrusive thoughts, if you will. Just doing small, spontaneous things. And the comments would say, oh, what a great use of free will, or I'm not using my free will enough. And at first it was just funny, but then it kept coming back to me. And eventually I thought, actually, that's a genuinely good point. If I want to do something, I don't have to justify why. As long as I'm not hurting anyone, I don't need to explain myself. And so I started noticing how often I was doing exactly that. Justifying, explaining, building a whole case for a choice that was, at its core, just something I wanted to do. And I think a really common place this shows up is when you're living with someone, particularly as an adult, cohabiting with another adult, whether that's a partner, a family member, a housemate. Sometimes it can feel like there's this unspoken negotiation that happens around your time and your choices. If you disappear to your room and you might say no to something, or you spend money on something and suddenly you feel like you owe an explanation, even when no one has actually asked for one. And I think that a lot of that is internalized. It's not always coming from the other person. I think it's coming from this assumption that your wants need to be validated before they're acceptable. That I just wanted to isn't quite enough on its own. But here's the thing. Because I want to is a complete sentence. It's similar to how we talk about consent, or it was very much when I thought of this phrase, inspired by the structure of that sentence, of that phrase of how no is a full sentence that doesn't require justification. Because the same applies here. If you need a reason for doing something, wanting to do it is reason enough. You don't need to elaborate. And this shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. For example, buying something. You might get asked, oh, why did you buy that? Do you need it? Could you have got a cheaper version? And we feel like we have to justify spending money even when it's our own. and it can take the joy out of it completely. Another big one at the moment is rest. That feeling like we have to justify resting and relaxing, even to ourselves sometimes. Almost like it has to be socially acceptable to not be productive, which, when you say out loud, is a bit of a wild thing to have internalized. Because rest is essential. It's not laziness, it literally helps us function. And yet I feel it's one of the things we over-explain the most. Another one, saying no to things. If you don't want to go somewhere, that should be enough. But it rarely feels like it is. And I think we've reached this point where our own wants and desires don't feel like sufficient reason. So we embellish them. We tailor the explanation so the other person reacts in a way that feels safe. We just want, really, someone to say, okay, cool, and move on. And that's it. And this connects directly back to something I talked about in episode 2, the one about the habit of telling white lies. Because I think over-explaining is really just a softer version of the same thing. You adjust the narrative to make it more digestible. You add reasons to your reasons. And you build this whole story when really all you needed to say was, because I want to. It's almost like people pleasing with extra steps. And the antidote, at least for me, has been learning to just do things without explaining them. Just cracking on with it. Not recklessly, not without thought. Because that's something I want to be really clear about here, because it's important. When I talk about free will being reason enough, when I say you don't need to justify your choices, I mean that with one very clear boundary. As long as you're not hurting anyone, including yourself. That's it. Because free will isn't a free pass. It's not an excuse to be careless with other people or with yourself. And this does also connect to what I was talking about in the last episode, with how the responsibility is yours. All of it. The freedom and the accountability come together. Because I don't think you can claim one without the other. So when I say wanting something is reason enough, I mean wanting something that doesn't come at someone else's expense. Choices that are genuinely yours, not ones that are made by offloading something onto someone else. And that distinction matters to me because this podcast isn't about self-improvement as selfishness. It's about self-awareness as something you do with integrity. And part of adulthood is holding both, your own desires and the awareness of what they might lead to. And I'll be honest, this is particularly hard when you're self-aware, because being self-aware means you're already anticipating reactions and maybe even mapping out scenarios and thinking about the knock-on effects of your choices. And it can get so overwhelming that it might even stop you from doing anything at all. Which is basically, it's kind of the irony of it, especially with self-awareness sucking in this context specifically, because the more conscious you are of your choices, the more you can talk yourself out of them before you've even started. You overthink the justification before anyone else has even asked for one. 5 years ago, I never would have started a podcast because I was so worried about what people would think, what they would say, how they'd judge me. Whereas now I'm leaning into, I felt like it, so I did it. And it's actually made me more decisive and more confident and even more present in my own choices. And I feel like, to some degree, that I move differently now. I feel more relaxed almost, that especially like if I want to do something, I just do it. I don't explain it. And it feels really good. I'm assuming it's because it's acting on that instinctual part of yourself. But I'm not, like I say, I'm not a psychologist, so I could be wrong. But I'm still learning. I still catch myself over-explaining. But the shift has been noticeable. And this journey, everything about it is ongoing. You notice one thing, then another one pops up. And this is one of those things for me. Learning how to act on my own choices without explaining them. And I want to connect this back to something I've mentioned previously. This idea of the stories we build around ourselves. Because over-explaining isn't just about other people. It's also about how we narrate our own choices internally. The justifications we construct for ourselves. And when those justifications become a habit, they can subtly shape how we see what we're allowed to want. Here's what I've noticed. When you're constantly explaining your choices, even just to yourself, I think you start to internalize the idea that your wants need to be earned. That they need to be reasonable enough, justified enough, acceptable enough. And over time, that can make you second guess things before you've even given yourself the chance to try them. You start editing yourself before anyone has asked you to. And that connects to something I do keep coming back to. How much of what we think we want or don't want is actually ours? How much of it has been shaped by how we think we're being seen? By the versions of ourselves we think we're supposed to be performing? And how does that show up in the way we treat ourselves day to day? Not just in our choices, but in how we feel in ourselves. Those are threads I want to pull on properly later in this series, because each one deserves its own space and I have a lot to say about them. But the starting point, I think, is this. Noticing where you're telling yourself a story about what you're allowed to want and asking whether that story is actually yours. As always, I want to leave you with a question. And as always, it's just something to sit with if it resonates. But do feel free to share any thoughts you have. Where are you still explaining something you don't actually need to explain? Thank you so much for listening. In the next episode, I'm getting into something I think a lot of people will relate to. The idea that what we call cringe might actually just be confidence. I'll see you then. Bye!